Hello. We return to Blood Wedding. At the reception in Act 2, the bride is already chafing under everything that marriage customs imply, above all, entrapment. Even though she said she wanted marriage to protect her from her desire for Leonardo, it has indeed had the opposite effect. Marriage seems to her already a burden. And the bridegroom's mother sees this discontentment, and the bride herself acknowledges it at the reception. The mother says, "Your blessings weigh heavily." The bride says, "Like lead," to which the mother replies, "But they shouldn't. You should be as light as a dove." Well, the groom also senses that something is wrong when the bride won't join him in a dance, and he finds this difficult to understand. He suggests that let's go dance for a bit, and he kisses her. The bride, disturbed, says, "No, I want to lie down on the bed." The bridegroom, "Well, then I'll come with you." "No," she says, "not with all these people here. What would they say? Let me rest for a moment." The bridegroom says, "Well, whatever you want, but don't be like this tonight," to which the bride, standing at the door about to leave, says, "I'll be better tonight." The bridegroom, "I hope you will." Now, this is an important moment. The bride is clearly deeply conflicted. She asks her new husband at first not to go because she's afraid of what she might do. For example, when the bridegroom says, "We've taken our vows," the bride says, "Yes, but leave me be now. What's the matter?" It's as if you're frightened. "It's nothing. No, don't go." On the one hand, she says, "Don't go," because she's afraid of what she might be capable of doing, of where her lawless passion will take her, but she feels so overpowered by her desire that she says, "It's as if someone struck me on the head." But she also tells the groom to let her go, to let her be, that she wants to be alone, ostensibly to rest. But really, it is to run off at this moment with Leonardo. Her remark at the end of the passage I read, "I'll be better tonight," is coded. The groom thinks she means that she'll be ready to enjoy their wedding night, but in this moment of double discourse, the bride is really speaking to herself. She means, "I'll be better tonight because I'll be with Leonardo." Well, this is the moment of Aristotelian hamartia, a mistake that will lead to a tragic calamity. But it's not a mistake enacted through free will, because the bride isn't capable of thinking or acting freely here. Like Phaedra, she's operating under the force of a primal erotic compulsion. The power of her desire for Leonardo dictates her flight with him, and her struggle against that desire is futile. When we next see the bride in Act 3, she and Leonardo are on the run in the moonlight. But now, you ask, how do we know that she intended to run away with Leonardo when she said, "I'll be better tonight"? Well, the answer lies, I think, in an important but subtle exchange that occurred just a few moments before she made that remark to the groom. Here, bridegroom says, "Did you like your orange blossom?" And the bride, looking at him, says, "Yes." The bridegroom, "It's all made of wax. It'll last forever. I'd like you to have worn them all over your dress." "Oh, there's no need for that," she says. Leonardo then goes off to the right, passing by them. And a girl says, "We'll take the pins out," to which the bride says to the bridegroom, "I'll be back in a minute." A moment later, the wife, the bridegroom's wife, Leonardo's wife, enters and says, "Where's Leonardo?" The servant says, "I haven't seen him." The bridegroom says, "He must be with the guests." The wife says, "I'll go and see," and she leaves. The servant says, "Ah, that's beautiful." Now, the important thing that is happening here is occurring off stage, where both Leonardo and the bride go almost simultaneously. He leaves, and then she makes an excuse and follows him. She sees him depart, excuses herself, follows him, and in their brief absence together off stage, that's when they seem to plan their getaway, which occurs shortly thereafter. The wife is already suspicious. "Where's Leonardo?" she asks. Well, the groom's attitude toward the bride is clearly smothering. He says that he would like to cover her with waxed orange blossoms as a mark of his possession of her as his wife, as his property. And the bride resists this. She says there's no need for that. Well, even though Leonardo seems to have asked the bride to run away during their brief off-stage meeting, when she returns, as we saw, she is still conflicted. As I've noted, she's both afraid of a restricted, isolated life with a man she doesn't love, and afraid of the lawless passion she feels for Leonardo. And this twofold terror in the bride comes out when the groom embraces her unexpectedly from behind. She instinctively thinks that it must be Leonardo, and consider how she reacts. The bridegroom slowly enters and embraces the bride from behind. The bride, "Don't. Are you frightened of me?" Oh, it's you. Who else? Me or your father? Yes. Though your father would have hugged you more gently. Yes, she says. Because he's old. He embraces her strongly and a bit more roughly, to which she says, "Stop it." "Why?" he says, releasing her. Well, the guests, they can see us. "Yes, but we've taken our vows." "Yes, but leave me for now." Okay, now, note that at this moment, the bride is afraid of any embrace. She's afraid of the binding embrace of either her new husband or her father, but she's also afraid of Leonardo's embrace. Thus, her startled response, precisely because that embrace and everything it implies is forbidden, and because she longs for it so much. She's afraid of her own desire. Well, the barrier of marriage, with all of the social and religious emphasis on monogamy, has only intensified both her desire for Leonardo and her dread of that desire for him. As Act 2 ends, the wife announces they've run away, and the mother, who fears the blood feud now, urges her son to renew it, urges him to take vengeance against Leonardo, both as the man who stole his wife and as a member of the hated Felix clan. She too now is swept up in this force of family history at the end of Act 2. The wife says, they've run away, her and Leonardo on horseback, arms around one another, like a flash of lightning. The father, "No, it can't be true, not my daughter." To the mother, "Yes, your daughter, a plant from a wicked mother, and him too. But now he's my son's wife. Well, let's go and help my son." The people split into groups. "He's got plenty of family, his cousins from the coast and all those from inland. Go out from here, search all the roads. The hour of blood has come again. Two sides, you on yours, me on mine. After them, get after them." The mother's words there, "the hour of blood has come again," unites the folk tragedy of a local war between two families in southern Spain with the universalizing conventions of Greek tragedy, in which destinies are inherited and enacted by successive generations of the same family, as we saw with the House of Atreus. Those words also remind us of the play's mythic framework by suggesting that all human history is really a repetition of the same basic stories and elemental patterns. The hour comes round again. Well, I hope you enjoyed the film clip from the Spanish film director Carlos Suarez's flamenco version of Blood Wedding. He presents the actions of the play without dialogue, entirely in the passionate style of dance that originated in Andalusia, the region of Spain where the play is set, even though flamenco is not what the characters are actually dancing at the wedding reception within the play itself. In the 2-minute clip I sent you, you see depicted a pivotal sequence at the reception near the end of Act 2. First, we see the bride dancing with Leonardo's suspicious-looking wife. Then we see her dancing dutifully with the bridegroom, but only briefly. She's distracted, and the bride pushes him away and runs off stage, as she does in the text, to join Leonardo as they had arranged, and in her absence, the groom dances with his mother, while Leonardo's wife rushes out to follow the bride. She knows what has happened, and her agitated gestures when she returns indicate that she's announcing to the crowd that the bride and Leonardo have absconded together. When we begin Act 3, we find that the style of the tragedy has undergone a radical transformation. What had been a hybrid blend of folk realism and symbolism now becomes a full-blown symbolist fantasia. The trio of woodcutters who converse at the start are clearly modeled on an ancient Greek chorus. And like a chorus in Sophocles or Euripides, this chorus does two familiar things. First, they comment on the action, specifically the lovers' escape into the forest, and second, they express sympathy for them. The woodcutters are afraid that the moon will illuminate the lovers and expose them to the groom's posse, who is in hot pursuit. The woodsmen understand that the lovers were driven to their action by the passion in their blood and what they had to surrender to, a primal desire which overrode absolutely everything. And the woodcutters understand that this passion is very likely to ensure the lover's death, even as they celebrate that passion. The first says, when the moon rises, they'll see them. The second, they should leave them alone. The first, yes, the world's big. Everyone can live in it. You have to follow your instinct. They were right to run away. Yes, they were deceiving each other. In the end, the blood was strongest. Yes, another says, the blood. You have to follow the blood's path. But blood that sees the light, the earth drinks it. The first says, well, what of it? Better to be a bloodless corpse than alive with your blood putrid. Now, this celebration of passion is voiced by sympathetic woodcutters for the fugitive couple. They sympathize with a desire that violates social and religious precepts because they themselves, these woodcutters, live outside society, in nature, among the giant trees. They see that the lover's passion is entirely natural as the world they inhabit. Appropriately, the woodcutters are associated with sexual release and phallic splendor. They live among what Lorca describes as great moist tree trunks. Yet curiously, these men have no women themselves, and paradoxically, they cut down the tree trunks, as the play indeed shows the young men themselves, both of them, being cut down. Nevertheless, the woodcutters indulge in a vicarious erotic fantasy as they imagine that at that very moment Leonardo and the bride are consummating their love. They celebrate this long-delayed sexual union. It will, they believe, have been worth the risk even if death follows. The first says, now he'll be loving her. The second, her body for him, his body for her. The third, they'll find them and they'll kill them. To which the first says, but they will have mixed their blood by then. They'll be like two empty pitchers, like two dry streams. Now, unfortunately, the woodcutters are wrong about one thing. Leonardo and the bride don't sexually consummate their desire, as we soon learn. They are too busy fleeing to do it. As the bride puts it, just before they're discovered, quote, let leaves weep for me, a woman lost and a virgin. She knows that society will view her as lost, that is to say, they'll assume that she has committed adultery, even though she hasn't, because the greater tragedy is that she's going to die a virgin because Leonardo and her husband will kill each other before she and Leonardo can consummate their love. Now, the woodcutters' idea of sex, as they speak of it here, is not just a stirring of the blood, but an actual mixing of the blood of a man and woman in intercourse. It's an idea that traces back to the Middle Ages. The same is true of the woodcutter's celebration of sex as a kind of death that leaves the lovers, quote, like two empty pitchers. It's the idea of orgasm as what the French call la petite mort, a little death. But the woodcutters also suggest that a love as forbidden as Leonardo and the bride's can find its fulfillment only in death because that love won't be allowed to persist in the world. Now, we too, like the woodcutters, probably expect that the lovers will be found and killed together, only to find that Lorca subverts this idea of love in death in a disturbing way. Now, the moon enters as an anthropomorphized character at this point, that is, taking the visible form of a solitary woodcutter with a white face. At first, the moon is the symbolic embodiment of death itself, and he casts his pale spectral light over almost all of the action in Act 3. The moon's cold beams stalk the runaway lovers, threatening to expose them, because the moon opposes the vitalism of the woodcutters with a desire, it seems, to extinguish all life. Unlike the protective woodcutters, the cold moon wants to shed his beams on the couple so that the posse can find and destroy them. Thus, at the beginning, the moon says, they shall not escape. The moon places a knife abandoned in the sky that is a leaden ambush and longs to be the pain of blood. But the snow bears me on its back of jasper, and water drowns me cold in hard pools. And so tonight there'll be red blood. Okay. Now, you'll note here that the moon describes itself as cold and bent on destruction. It wants to punish sexual passion, and thus it seeks the lover's death. The moon specifically associates itself in that passage with the knife, a knife which, of course, later, an actual knife, will be used to inflict a twofold death, specifically two knives. But as with every other symbol that Lorca introduces into this play, he complicates the meaning of the moon. It soon becomes clear that this cold, lonely moon actually envies sexual passion rather than hating it. He craves the hot, aroused blood of human desire for himself in a vampiric way, and the only way to satisfy his desire for blood is indeed to take the lives of those who have it coursing through them. Thus, he says, he wishes for the red blood to fill my cheeks that rushes, forming clusters at the wide feet of the wind. For I want to enter a breast where I can warm myself. Oh, let me come in. Oh, let me come in. No, they shan't get away. I shall make the horse shine. Well, the pale moon, paradoxically, becomes passionate when he thinks about absorbing the passionate life of the lovers. But Lorca complicates the moon's meaning even more when Leonardo responds to the moonlight. Rather than associating the moon with coldness and exposure and death, which Lorca has initially, Leonardo tells the bride that the moonlight around them is the outward expression of the incandescent, binding desire they feel for one another. Seeing the moonlight, now he says take a step. See, nails of moonlight join us, my waist and your hips. We're told the whole scene is very strong and full of great sensuality. Okay, nails of moonlight suggest, of course, a force of destiny. Desire conjoins them to each other, as Leonardo says. But the same image of nails that he uses to evoke their erotic longing points, of course, to the inevitable bloodshed that will follow. The phrase nails anticipates the violent penetration of the bodies of Leonardo and the groom with steel knives. Well, when we first see the bride in Act 3, she is tormented by guilt and remorse for acting on a libidinal need that she hates herself for but has been unable to resist. Like Phaedra, her erotic longing is a source of simultaneous pleasure and agony as she castigates herself in the forest. She says, there's not a minute of the day that I don't want to be with you because you drag me. But, she says, I am a bitch because that's what I am. Oh, I look at you and your beauty burns me. She says that she feels worthless because she has left a good man and all his family in the middle of my wedding wearing a bride's crown. Now, you'll note then that she is both deeply impassioned at this moment, but tormented with guilt. And when she speaks this way, she uses the language of fire. She says that your beauty burns me, to which Leonardo replies, flame is fired by flame, and the same small flame can kill 2 ears of grain together. Come on. Now, the flame of the bride's desire fills her with an intense sense of life, but also with the exquisite pain of the guilt and self-contempt she voices when she speaks of herself as a betraying bitch. Leonardo, by contrast, doesn't any longer blame himself for his desire. He doesn't blame himself for leaving his spouse as the bride does. He had felt guilt in the past, but Leonardo is now beyond guilt because he knows that he has tried to hold his passion in check by marrying the bride's cousin, but that he and the bride are simply moved by a force originating in nature, in the earth itself, that is too strong to be resisted. Thus, when he speaks of it, he says, I'm not the one at fault. The fault belongs to the earth and that scent that comes from your breasts and your hair, which seems to be an emanation of the earth itself. Now, within this natural setting, the forest, Leonardo wants to take the bride at this point, as they're on the run, to a secret place to seal their passion, to consummate their desire. But he foresees that just as they burn, as he puts it, with a single flame of desire, so too this flame will destroy them when he says that it can kill 2 ears of grain together. He anticipates, in short, that after consummation, they will be destroyed, killed together. Now, like blood then, fire is a symbolic element, as he speaks of it, an element both of passionate life and of violent death. But ironically, the 2 ears of grain that are incinerated together here are not Leonardo and the bride, as we expect and as the woodcutters expect, but rather the 2 are Leonardo and the groom. So there's no climactic Wagnerian moment of lovemaking that suddenly is followed by a transfiguring death, the way the woodcutters had envisioned it. There's no moment of sexual consummation at all for Leonardo and the bride. This, despite the vow that the 2 make to one another just before they are found, as they embrace. Leonardo says, "Come, listen." The bride hesitates. They hear the sound of the posse. "Both of us." Leonardo embracing her. "Whatever you want. If they separate us, it will be because I am dead," she says. "I am dead," Leonardo says, to which the bride replies, "And I will be dead too." They leave embracing each other in this vow to make love and die together. Well, this vow of love, this seal, is not just an anticipation of their death, but as they make it, the vow eclipses the wedding vow that the bride had made earlier in the day. But as they leave the stage embracing, the lovers are replaced by the moon, who has just exposed them. We hear immediately 2 long screams, which we mistakenly assume to be that of the 2 lovers who have just been discovered. Then another figure of death appears on stage along with the moon, a beggar woman with a cloak that she extends outward to resemble the wings of a huge black bird of death. The curtain comes down in total silence. You'll note that we don't see the actual killing. It's another nod on Lorca's part to Greek drama. He keeps the bloody violence off stage and presents it to us only in reports afterward. The first report comes not from an eyewitness, however, but from one of the girls who is winding a skein of wool. And this is clearly a reference to the fates of ancient myth who spun and cut the thread of human life. But the fabric that this girl is working with, is winding, is red, not black. And red, of course, carries with it here all of the accreting emblematic suggestions of that color. Blood lines, blood passion, blood feud, and blood shed. Now, one of these 2 girls has, with the skein, has seen not the killing, but rather what followed, 2 male bodies. She sees the aftermath, in which 2 men are covered with blood, and she reports this, much to our surprise. The girl says, "The lovers dumb, the young man red, on the silent shore I saw them spread." Now, you'll note that this report leaves us wondering what has actually happened. And the description of the actual killing itself comes only shortly thereafter from the old beggar woman, the embodiment of death itself, from the mouth of personified death. And what she says confirms the girl's report, but nonetheless surely shocks and surprises us. She says of them, "Their eyes broken flowers, and their teeth 2 fistsful of frozen snow. Both of them fell, and the bride comes back, her skirt and her hair stained with their blood, covered in blankets. Both of them come borne on the shoulders of tall young men." Now, you'll note that the bridegroom has heretofore been linked with carnations and Leonardo with roses. But now this figure of death says that the eyes of these 2 young men are broken flowers. The force of life has been broken in them, and their vitality is now replaced by icy snow. They have been drained of life and blood and passion. Ironically, the bride, who at times had wished to die herself in order to escape both her desire and her guilt, she is the one who survives. She must go on living. It's not, of course, the ending that Leonardo had envisioned with the bride in when they pledged to fulfill their passion in a secret place and then die together. No. While sad, that ending perhaps wouldn't have been entirely tragic. It might even have seemed like a glorious fulfillment and release for two lovers who could never be together on earth. The real tragedy of Blood Wedding takes a very different form. The living tragedy of Leonardo's and the bride's suffering as blocked lovers is bad, but that tragedy deepens immeasurably because the play denies the lovers the erotic fulfillment in death, just before death, that they had sought. What happens is much worse. While the fight is never explicitly described, Lorca certainly invites us to envision it. Leonardo and the groom, these two knife-wielding rivals from enemy clans, confront and stab one another, it seems, to death simultaneously. How else could there be two corpses lying side by side? They're in this position, lying together, instead of the bride and groom lying side by side on the marriage bed, or instead of Leonardo and the bride reclining side by side after sex. Leonardo is joined in death then, not with the bride, but rather in a moment of mutual penetration with the groom. This double knife thrust is the only penetration that occurs in the absence of a sexual one. Now, as some critics have noted, this seems like a strange homoerotic substitute for both the heterosexual consummation that the tree cutters had envisioned and for the love and death embrace that Leonardo and the bride had anticipated. The two men are physically united by knives, united by their blood, which flows together and stains the bride, and as the woodsman suggests, their blood, in a certain sense, commingles in sex. Commingles, but not as the woodcutters had imagined the blood of the bride and Leonardo commingling in intercourse. Well, this is the final, darkly ironic meaning, I think, of the title Blood Wedding. Two men joined together by each other's blood, by knives, by their love for the same woman, and by the sanguine history of their feuding families. All of those meanings of blood compulsion come together, surprisingly, in this mutual impaling. The bride must go on living, and as such, she is destined, as I noted, to die a virgin widow, doomed to a life of cloistered frustration like her mother-in-law and like Leonardo's widow. After Leonardo's death, his mother-in-law tells her daughter, quote, "Over your bed, place a cross of ash where once the pillow was." Well, as a widow, Leonardo's wife's life essentially is over. It's reduced to ashes. But unlike the mother, at least one might say, she has a young child. The cross that the mother-in-law refers to here, like the sign of the cross that the bridegroom's mother made earlier, has no power to redeem or relieve the death in life to which the play's three widows are consigned. Rather, a cross of ashes is an apt description for what their lives will be. Now, the groom's mother feels even more alone now than she had when she expected that her son would marry and leave. Now that he's dead, she says she must face, quote, "terrible days with my grief and me and these four walls." But perhaps the mother won't be entirely solitary. Rather than going back to the father's cave, the bride, surprisingly, comes to the house of her mother-in-law, who despises her and blames her for running off and thus for her son's death. Now, I think the bride comes to her mother-in-law's for two reasons. First, although the bride talks about putting her hands in fire to punish herself, she goes there not to atone for her sins so much, but rather in the hope that the older woman will kill her, thereby both inflicting pain on her, but in so doing freeing her in death from her unbearable guilt and grief. The bride says, I'm coming here, the mother says. Who is it? Ah, the mother says, that's why I'm asking who is it, because I mustn't know her, so I shan't sink my teeth into her neck. Serpent! She moves toward the bride threateningly when she sees her and then stops. And then, we're told, she strikes the bride, who falls to the ground. The bride says, oh, when the neighbor tries to intervene, leave her. I came so that she could kill me, so that they could bear me away with them. Now, you'll note that a moment later, she urges her, take your revenge on me. Here I am. See how soft my throat is. Less effort for you than cutting a dahlia in your garden. But no, not that. No. Now, tempted, although she is, to kill the bride, the groom's mother won't oblige her in this, almost because death would be too easy for her nemesis, and it is also what the bride asks for. It would be to fulfill the desire of a woman she despises. So she says, what does your death mean to me? What does anything matter to me? Now, the bride comes for a second reason, I think, and that is to explain herself, not to justify her betrayal and her flight, but rather to appeal to the old woman's understanding of why it happened. She explained, I went off with the other one. Yes, I went in anguish. You would have gone too. I was a woman burning, full of pain inside and out, and your son was a little drop of water that I hoped would give me children and land and health, but the other one was a dark river full of branches that brought me to the sound of its reeds and its soft song. Yes, that other one's arms dragged me like a wave from the sea, like the butt of a mule, and would always have dragged me, always, always, even if I'd been an old woman and had all sorts of sons and had tried to hold me down by the hair. Even then, no one could have held me down. Now, in this moment of the bride, this is, I think, the moment of the bride's fullest Aristotelian self-recognition. She understands how and why her tragedy has occurred and explains it to the mother. She's certain that despite her efforts to resist, and she certainly made them, her fall was inevitable, incontrovertible. She's compelled, she explains, by a power beyond her control. Her craving for Leonardo was a dark river, a sea wave, a force of nature. Unlike him, however, the bride still blames herself, even though she realizes that she had no choice, and she wants the mother to know that. Thus, she tells her mother-in-law that she is still pure, still a virgin, not by any intention of her own, obviously, but rather by tragic circumstance. Her mother-in-law dismisses this technical virginity by asking sarcastically, what does your honor mean to me? What does it matter? What does anything matter? Well, it's a fair rejoinder, because the bride has indeed brought shame on the mother's dead son by leaving him, and certainly everyone will assume that she and Leonardo became lovers before they were found. Yet, despite the mother's deep antagonism, she seems moved by one thing that the bride says, when the bride says, you would have gone too. That is, if you felt the desire that consumed me, you would have fled your own wedding. Now, the mother has spoken in the past longingly of the erotic pleasure she once enjoyed with her husband, and the bride's appeal seems to strike that chord. Enough so that at the end of the play, the mother and the bride seem destined to live together in the older woman's house, sharing their sexual frustration. The two are also, of course, united in grief as they join together in a chant of lamentation at the end of the play that recalls the earlier lullaby that the Leonardo's mother and mother-in-law chanted. Now the bride says, let the cross protect the living and the dead. The mother neighbors with a knife, with a small knife, on a day appointed between 2 and 3, the two men killed each other for love. To which the bride then chants, and this is a knife, a small knife, that barely fits the hand. And the mother, that barely fits the hand, that slides in clean through the startled flesh and stops there at the place where trembles enmeshed the dark root of a scream. Now, this dark root of the scream is a phrase she used earlier to describe the sense of stifled anguish. They both feel this now. Although the bride invokes the cross to protect the living and the dead, we have seen how ineffectual religion is in either regulating sexual desire in this play or in preventing bloodshed. Instead, the groom repeats his father's destiny in a blood feud, and the bride repeats her mother's destiny by violating her marriage vows, and Leonardo's wife repeats her mother's destiny as a betrayed woman. As in Riders to the Sea, the play's bereft women continue to pray, to invoke God's aid as they seek solace. But in the face of the catastrophes, Christianity seems little more than a stockpile of hollow symbols and ineffectual gestures and rituals. Instead of the cross, the play's final image, appropriately, is the one that was introduced in the first scene, the knife. By returning to this symbol, this blade that can hold in the palm of a hand, by returning to that, Lorca reminds us that the catastrophe we witnessed was, in a sense, inevitable from the knife's very first appearance, when we saw it in the hand of the bridegroom as he left to go out to the vineyard. The same kind of blade he used to cut grapes, to eat, also cut off another man's life at the same moment that his own life was cut short by another knife. The dark root of the scream that emerges from this double death end is then the stifled cry of the two women who are doomed to spend their lives together in a strange, strained, solitary world, away from the larger world, confined by two thick walls. Now, whereas Strindberg ends The Father misogynistically with the triumph of an evil woman taking possession of a daughter, Blood Wedding ends with what seems to me Lorca's unmistakable compassion for the plight of the play's women. And in this, I think he's even more attuned to the position and suffering of women under patriarchy than Ibsen is. Okay, we move on now. Having started in ancient Greece and passed through Britain, France, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Ireland, and Spain, almost a tour of Europe, we now continue our study of tragedy with an American work. Along with Eugene O'Neill and Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller is one of the dominant American dramatists of the mid-20th century. Born into a Jewish family in New York, he began writing plays in the mid-1940s and first made his mark with a family drama titled All My Sons in 1947. The dynamics of middle-class American life, and family life in particular, would be one of Miller's hallmarks throughout his career, most notably in The Death of a Salesman, which premiered on Broadway in 1949 and was immediately hailed as a masterpiece. Since then, it has been mounted countless times at all levels, and it's been the subject of at least 2 film adaptations. Now, at the height of Miller's career, in the 1950s, 2 remarkable things occurred, this in the years following Death of a Salesman. In 1956, he divorced his wife of 15 years and married the actress Marilyn Monroe, in what was regarded as one of the more improbable celebrity unions ever, a cerebral playwright and the country's most famous sex symbol who had been married briefly before this to the baseball legend Joe DiMaggio. To the surprise of many, Monroe converted to Judaism to marry Miller, and his children loved her. Not long after their marriage, Miller was called to testify before the notorious House Committee on Un-American Activities, led by the notorious Joseph McCarthy and Donald Trump's old associate, Roy Cohn. Now, unlike some others who were summoned to testify, Miller steadfastly refused to name names in this paranoid search for would-be communists. 3 years earlier, Miller saw what was going on and wrote a play based on these hysterical interrogations at the height of the Cold War. That play, which some of you probably know, is The Crucible, set during the witch trials in 17th century Salem, Massachusetts, but really about the witch trials that were taking place in the United States. Not surprisingly, about this time, Miller's marriage to Marilyn Monroe began to unravel, and they divorced after 5 years. Miller chronicled the relationship and his feeling of torment at Marilyn's self-destructive personality and emotional dependency in an experimental psychodrama of 1964 titled After the Fall. Well, Miller lived to be 90, and in the decades that followed after the fall, he continued to write works that, to one degree or another, reflected his conception of tragedy, which I will describe in a moment. These plays include a World War II drama, Incident at Vichy, set during the interrogations in Nazi-occupied France, and 2 blistering family dramas, View from a Bridge, set on the docks of Red Hook, Brooklyn, and The Price in 1968. After that, after the late 60s, Miller never again reached the height of his earlier work, but 4 or 5 of his best plays have taken their place in the canon of enduring American drama, and especially Death of a Salesman. It's the purest illustration of Miller's renowned theory of tragedy that he published in an essay, Tragedy in the Common Man, in 1949, the same year that Death of a Salesman premiered. Although Miller never mentions Aristotle by name, the essay is clearly directed against Aristotelian theory and the sway it has held over tragic drama for over 2 millennia. Miller begins by disputing the idea that a tragic hero must, as Aristotle suggests, be a person of high rank. He says that we are often held nowadays to be below tragedy, which explains why there are few tragedies being written today, or we sense that tragedy is somehow above us. And the inevitable conclusion is, of course, that the tragic mode is archaic, fit only for the very high-placed, the kings or the kingly. But insistence upon the rank of the tragic hero, or the so-called nobility of his character, is really nothing but a clinging to the outward forms of tragedy. I believe that the common man is as apt a subject for tragedy in its highest sense as kings were. If the exaltation of tragic action were truly the property of the high-bred character alone, it is inconceivable that the mass of mankind should cherish tragedy above all other forms, let alone be capable of understanding it. Now, note that Miller notes that ordinary people in an audience sympathize with the suffering of high-ranking characters in, say, Sophocles or Shakespeare, because class differences ultimately don't matter very much in the reception of tragedy. The idea that tragic nobility requires a king or some great military leader, he suggests, is simply an outdated form, non-essential to tragedy. And it's a form that Miller challenges by presenting tragic heroes who are what he calls common men. What generates tragedy, Miller argues, and can be true of an individual of any class or caste, is a character's struggle to assert his or her personal dignity, to assert his or her rightful place in the world. And this model applies not just to princes and generals, but also can apply to aging salesmen. He says, I think the tragic feeling is evoked in us when we are in the presence of a character who is ready to lay down his life if need be to secure one thing, his personal dignity. From Orestes to Hamlet, from Medea to Macbeth, the underlying struggle is that of the individual attempting to gain his rightful position in society. The commonest of men may take on tragic stature to the extent of his willingness to throw all he has into the battle to secure his rightful place in the world. Well, for Miller, a character's tragic heroism, then, is something that arises from his resistance to those individuals or institutions that would strip him of his dignity, rob him of what he regards as his rightful place in the world. And while this resistance may lead the character to make mistakes, as we'll certainly see in Death of a Salesman, Miller disputes the popular idea that tragic heroes must have what we have come to call a tragic flaw, though that's not a term that Aristotle uses. He says the tragic flaw is not peculiar to grand and elevated characters, nor is it necessarily a weakness. The flaw or crack is really nothing and need be nothing, but the character's inherent unwillingness to remain passive in the face of what he conceives to be a challenge to his dignity, the image of his rightful status. Now, we'll see that Willy Loman does have flaws, undeniably, but for Miller, they're inseparable, these cracks in his character, from his resistance to the challenges to his dignity, to his rightful place in the world. Thus, in a certain sense for Miller, what makes him tragic and noble is also, in a sense, what we regard as his weaknesses, but they're not simply weaknesses. Now, Miller does agree with Aristotle's view that tragedy produces fear in the audience because of our identification with the protagonist. And the terror, he suggests, as Aristotle does, arises from the fact that we feel that we too could be in this situation, robbed of our idea of ourselves, robbed of a sense of the basis of our own dignity. From the total onslaught by an individual against the scheme of things that degrades him is the seemingly stable cosmos surrounding us. From that comes the terror and fear that is classically associated with tragedy. The protagonist's thrust for freedom is the quality in which tragic exalts. What shakes us is the underlying fear of being displaced ourselves, the disaster being inherent in being torn away from our chosen image of what and who we are in the world. Our identification and sense that we too could be displaced. We too could suffer this indignity. Now, you'll note that he speaks of terror and fear, and you might ask, wait a minute, in Aristotle, it's fear and pity. Fear and terror are essentially the same thing. What happens to pity? Well, although Aristotle shares the sense that fear is an inevitable part of the tragic response in an audience, he says that pity can play and should play no place in this. He profoundly, in this respect, rejects Aristotle's conception that we must feel a combination of terror and pity for the protagonist. Miller says that pity per se is incompatible with tragedy because pity arises when we feel that there is no real hope for the figure ever succeeding. For Miller, tragedy requires that we believe that there is always what he calls the possibility that the figure, the protagonist, could triumph over adversity through the effort of his resistant will. Thus, he writes, there is a misconception about tragedy. The idea that tragedy is of necessity filled with pessimism. But in truth, tragedy implies optimism in its author, for the hero's struggle automatically demonstrates the indestructible will of man to achieve his humanity. The possibility of victory must be there in tragedy. Where pathos, where pity rules, a character has fought a battle he could not possibly have won because he's incapable of grappling with a superior force. Pathos is truly a mode for the pessimist. Now, you'll note then, in this respect, we are not meant to pity Willy Loman when we identify with his struggle. We can only pity an individual who Miller believes we recognize as having no hope. An individual who simply we sense could not succeed at all. For Miller, tragedy requires that we always sense that there's the possibility that the figure could regain his dignity, triumph over adversity. Now, this is one statement in Miller's essay, I would suggest, where we might find Willy Loman does not absolutely correspond. Because I think we have to ask ourselves, do we ever really believe that Willy could triumph over the forces that have consigned him to obscurity and humiliation and exhaustion? And despite what Miller says in this essay, I think the answer is no. We probably don't ever really believe that he could triumph. Okay, well, let's turn now to the play and begin with Miller's extensive opening stage directions. It's Brooklyn, 1949, 4 years after the end of World War II, a time of change in America. The nation is rebuilding in these post-war years. Neighborhoods are being uprooted, as Willie's is. A young generation of returning soldiers is re-entering the job market. And these social and economic changes are leaving the aging Willie feeling isolated and displaced. The threat of post-war modernity is reflected in the very description of the setting itself that we find. We're told a melody is heard played upon a flute. It's small and fine, telling of the grass and trees on the horizon. The curtain rises, and before us we see the salesman's house. We're aware of a towering angular shape behind it, surrounding it on all sides. The surrounding area shows an ugly glow of orange. As more light appears, we see a solid vault of apartment houses around the small, fragile-seeming house of Willy Loman. Willie's house is encircled by a new apartment complex, imposing and impersonal. Like his little house, Willie himself is fragile, both physically and mentally. As America moves headlong into the future, Willie clings increasingly to the past, or else he fantasizes an extravagant future that has little basis in reality. What Willie cannot bear clearly is the present, which he complains about to his long-suffering wife, Linda, beginning early in the play. He says, Linda, the street's now lined with cars. There's not a breath of fresh air in the neighborhood. The grass don't grow anymore. You can't raise a carrot in the backyard. They should have a law against those apartment houses. Oh, remember those two beautiful elm trees that used to be out there? Oh, they should have arrested the builder for cutting those trees down. They massacred the neighborhood. Oh, the more I think about those days, the more I think about the lilac and wisteria that are gone. We're told here and elsewhere, from the beginning of the play, that a flute is heard playing throughout. It's the thematic sound of Willie's past, which accompanies his recollections of the past, his recollections of grass and trees and lilacs, all the things now missing from the neighborhood. The flute plays especially when Willie drifts into memories, all of which ultimately trace back these memories in some way or other to Willie's father, who was a dreamer who made and sold wooden flutes and traveled all over the country, but a figure who, though Willie idealizes, he never really knew. Now, Willie's impossible future aspirations also trace back to the idea of this mysterious father. As a distinctly American tragedy, Death of a Salesman is rooted in the failure of two American myths that Willie associates with his father, who seemed to succeed in fulfilling those myths, and that Willie cherishes, but has been unable to fulfill himself, to act out himself the way his father did. The first of these two myths is the so-called Bootstrap Myth, the story of the little man of humble origins who becomes a great success through grit and determination and hard work. It's the Horatio Alger narrative. It's essentially the national myth that we call the American dream. The second American myth that Willie inherits, but also fails to live out to as his father had succeeded, is that of the American West as the place of opportunity, self-discovery, and success, from the pioneers to the California gold rush. Willie's father, who took the family westward to sell his flutes, actualized these two myths in Willie's mind, as did, Willie believes, his older brother Ben in his dealings and money-making scheme in Alaska. But Willie stays put, and his son Biff, in the present, reveals how bankrupt this dream of westward migration has become through his own abortive efforts to find fulfillment in the plains of Texas and the West. Now, even though Willie has failed to embody either the myth of American bootstrap success or westward migration, nonetheless, Willie tries to live vicariously through his sons, especially Biff, only to find that their failures and their unhappiness reinforce the emptiness of his own life and, in some way, the bankruptcy of these myths in post-war America. Both of Willie's sons, Biff and Happy, are miserable and as unfulfilled as Willie is. Just as the myths seem exhausted, so too at the beginning of the play, Willie himself is profoundly exhausted. Of him, we are told, he's past 60 years of age, dressed quietly. Even as he crosses the stage to the doorway of the house, his exhaustion is apparent, just in the way he walks. Now, you'll note that because he is unable to face the present or to find vicarious satisfaction in Biff or in the ironically misnamed Happy, because of that, Willie revisits past moments more and more, revisits times when he believed in himself, in his sons, and in the American dream, or at least believed in them more then than he does now. Willie's need to retreat is so great, to retreat from the present, that when the play opens, he finds that he's sometimes unable to separate past and present. It's not just that he willfully retreats into the past. Sometimes the past invades the present compulsively for him, as when he is sitting in the kitchen or when he is driving his car on the road. His mind is clearly beginning to break down under the crushing force of his failure as a salesman and a father. And one sign of that breakdown is that he, at times, quite beyond his intentions, cannot separate past and present. Now, Death of a Salesman is partly a memory play, in which Willie's recollections of his past intrude repeatedly into the present action on stage. And to evoke the force of the past in Willie's mind, and also his mental disintegration, Miller builds temporal fluidity into the very stage set. We're told whenever the action is in the present, actors observe the imaginary wall lines entering the house only through its doors at the left. But in the scenes of the past, these boundaries are broken, and characters enter or leave a room by stepping through a wall onto the forestage. Now, there are then no spatial walls in this house on stage because there are no temporal walls, as it were, separating the now and then in Willie's mind. The only anchor that Willie has in this mental decline and confusion is his wife, Linda. She is his only grip on reality and his only stay day to day against complete despair. Linda more than loves him. She admires him, Miller writes, as though his mercurial nature, his temper, his massive dreams and little cruelties served only as sharp reminders of the turbulent longings within him. Linda still believes in Willie as a great man of failed dreams, even when Willie can no longer believe in himself. He says to her rightly, "You're my foundation and my support." Now, there's an obvious discrepancy between what Miller calls Willie's massive dreams and his diminished reality. But these dreams, after all, are the key to his dignity. And fighting to realize these dreams, even if the dreams are misguided, is the essence of Willie's tragedy. For him, the fulfillment and pursuit of those dreams are his attempt to assert his dignity. When Willie first appears, he's so tired, so exhausted, that he says he couldn't complete his sales trip to New England. He scarcely got started. He's at the end of his rope, mentally and physically, and like the car he drives, he seems to be breaking down in every way. He tells Linda, "I'm tired to death. I couldn't make it. I just couldn't make it, Linda. I suddenly couldn't drive anymore. The car kept going onto the shoulder of the road, I realized, I'm going 60 miles an hour and I don't remember the last 5 minutes. I can't seem to keep my mind on anything. I was driving along, you understand, and I was fine. I was even observing the scenery. It's beautiful up there, Linda. Trees are so thick and the sun is warm, and I opened the windshield and let the warm air bathe over me, and then all of a sudden I'm going off the road." So I went on again, and 5 minutes later I'm dreaming again, and nearly he presses his two fingers to his eyes. "I have such thoughts, Linda. I have such strange thoughts." Now, note that in the late 1940s, automobiles had permanent windshields. You didn't have to lower them, as Willie refers to here, because Willie mistakenly thought as he drove in the present that he was driving his old red Chevrolet, which did require winding up and down the windshield. As he enters old age, Willie then sometimes drifts into the past compulsively, as he did while he was driving, not by a deliberate retreat. But as I've noted, he also does often deliberately try to escape present failure and disillusionment by hearkening back to moments when he felt greater hope. For many years now, he has hoped that Biff would redeem his own mediocrity by becoming a huge success. But Biff, his older son, is now 34, and we learn has drifted from job to job for years, much to Willie's anger and frustration, much to Willie's sense of betrayal. Willie's own definition of success in the context of the American dream is one of his fundamental problems, one of his fundamental tragic mistakes, even though it is something that is an elemental part of his sense of dignity. We see this misconception about the American dream, the Bootstrap Myth, in Willie's remarks to Linda about Biff. Willie says, "You work a lifetime, for a house, and then finally you own it and there's nobody to live in it." Linda says, dear, life is casting off. It's always that way." Willie says, "No, some people accomplish something. Hey, by the way, did Biff say anything after I left this morning?" And Linda says, "Well, you shouldn't have criticized him," to which Willie replies, "When the hell did I lose my temper? I simply asked Biff if he was making any money. Is that criticism?" Okay, when Willie complains about this, it reflects the fact that Willie regards success, the fulfillment of the American dream, as making money. But we'll see that there's another misconception about it too. Willie also believes that it means being popular. In fact, Willie naively believes that popularity is the way to wealth and has learned nothing from his own experience, which should have taught him that popularity, even if you achieve it, won't make you wealthy. Now, Willie is baffled and disappointed that Biff, who was once so popular in high school, has failed to exploit that popularity to become a financial success. So Willie then often seeks refuge, when he can control his memories, in recalling Biff's high school years, when Biff was all wonderful potential. Thus, he says to Linda, when Linda says, I think Biff is lost. I think he's very lost. Willie replies, Biff Loman lost in the greatest country in the world, a young man with such personal attractiveness. How could he get lost? Remember how they used to follow him around in high school when he smiled at one of them, their faces lit up when he walked down the street? Oh, Willie loses himself in reminiscences. Well, when Willie complains about Biff's lack of direction and financial success, he's really raging at his own loss of vicarious satisfaction. But he's also, Willie, in his anger at Biff, raging against the image of his own failure, which he sees reproduced in his older son. Willie has failed Biff, both as a member of the American capitalist order and role model, and he has also failed him as a father. When the play opens, Biff and Happy, it turns out, are at home at the same time. They're not usually there, but they are now. Biff has returned from Texas, where he'd been working as a lowly ranch hand again, and Happy is back from Manhattan, where he works unhappily as a businessman. They're both discontented, and they represent the failure of the two American myths that I mentioned, myths that their grandfathers seemed to successfully embody. Biff has not found himself or opportunity out west, and Happy finds that pulling himself up to a high salary has left him only lonely and miserable. Thus, through them, Miller subverts both of the myths in their first conversation, where, like Willie, the two of them try to escape the present by revisiting the glories of the past as they sit in the bedroom they used to share. Happy says with deep sentiment, funny, Biff, us sleeping here again. The old beds, he pats the bed affectionately, all the talk that went across those two beds our whole lives. Biff says, yeah, a lot of dreams and plans, to which Happy says, with a deep and masculine laugh, about 500 women would like to know what was said in this room, brother. Yes. Well, having watched Willie's struggles, Biff rejects the life of money-making and the rat race of American capitalism. He sees them as venal and disillusioning, but on the other hand, Biff can't shake the feeling that he is squandering his own life, not knowing what to do, and just drifting around the vast spaces of the American West. He says, I spent 6 or 7 years after high school trying to work myself up, shipping clerk, salesman, businessman of one kind or another, and it's a measly matter of existence to get on that subway on hot mornings in the summer, devote your whole life to keeping stock and making phone calls, buying and selling. Not for me. So I went out west, and Pap, I've had 20 or 30 different kinds of jobs since I left home before the war, and it always turns out the same. Whenever the spring comes, wherever I am, I suddenly get the feeling, my God, I'm not getting anywhere. What the hell am I doing? Playing around with horses and $28 a week. I'm 34 years old. I ought to be making my future. Now, Happy is no less disillusioned. He's driven to make money, but material gain has left him depressed, unfulfilled, alienated. Rising in the corporate world has not produced any satisfaction at all. He says, I don't know what the hell I'm working for sometimes, Biff. Sometimes I sit in my apartment all alone and I think of the rent I'm paying and it's all crazy. And then it's what I always wanted, but my apartment and my car and plenty of women and still, goddammit, I'm lonely. Yeah. Now, you might note that the only thing that keeps Happy at his job at all is his bitter desire to undermine his bosses by sleeping with their wives and girlfriends. This is what he has gleaned from capitalism, from competition. His behavior, Happy's, is really a protest against the business world and its ethos of ruthless competition. Happy exploits competition destructively because he blames it for making him unhappy. Thus, he confides to his brother, I got to show those pompous, self-important executives over there that Hap Loman can make the grade. So, I seduced their wives and girlfriend. That girl Charlotte I was with tonight is engaged to be married in 5 weeks. You're kidding. No, sure, the guy's in line for a vice presidency of the store. I don't know what gets into me. Maybe I just have an overdeveloped sense of competition or something. But I went and I ruined her. And furthermore, I can't get rid of her. And he's the third executive now that I've done that to. Yeah, I just hate myself for it, but I do it anyway. I hate them. Now, even though neither brother is satisfied, ironically, Biff tries to lure Happy out west to raise cattle, and Happy encourages Biff to take a business job in the city. inviting them to do things that they know they are completely unqualified for. Ironically, they urge each other to do what hasn't worked for them because neither one of them knows what he wants or what he should want. Like Willie, then, these sons are disillusioned and uncertain about themselves. They hear Willie's voice in the kitchen, where he is drinking milk. Willie is lost in the past and is speaking aloud to Biff and Happy, thinking that they are still boys. He's lost past and present distinction. Now, the particular memory in which Willie is speaking and longing to recapture is one that suggests that his dreams have been unfulfilled, but that the moment he is recalling was a moment when it seemed like they might be fulfilled. Specifically, it's Biff's senior year in high school, when he was a football star and a ladies' man. This is about 16 years now in the past. Biff and Happy, in this memory, are waxing Willie's red Chevy, the one that he imagined he was driving on the road. And at first it seems to be a moment in which Willie possesses everything that his present life lacks and denies him. It seemed to be a moment of relative prosperity, marked by a shiny red car, by family unity as they polish it together, and by the adoration and trust of his sons. Indeed, Biff and Happy are eager to please Willie and to learn from him as Willie delights in it. Biff, taking Willie's hand, says, "This Saturday, Pop, this Saturday, just for you, I'm going to break through for a touchdown." Happy reminds him, "But you're supposed to pass." To which Biff says, "No, I'm taking one play for Pop. You watch, Pop. And when I take off my helmet, that means I'm breaking out. Then you watch me crash through that line." Willie says, kissing Biff, "Oh, wait till I tell them this. Wait till they hear this in Boston." Now, note that Willie is drawn to this memory because it was at a moment when he still believed not just in his sons, but in his own future. That is, in his ability to live out the American dream as a successful and well-liked salesman. It is what he speaks of when he tells the boys, "You and Hap and I, will show them all the towns in America. I'll show you. America's full of beautiful towns, boys, and fine, upstanding people. And they'll know me, boys. They know me up there. They know me all up and down New England." Now, underlying this confidence, this exaggerated confidence at this moment in the past in Willie, is a great deal of need. Just as Biff and Happy crave Willie's approval as boys, so too Willie, even in the past, needs their adoration to sustain this inflated idea of himself. Thus, their needs fed off one another. But as Willie's memory of this moment 16 years earlier continues, it reveals Willie's weaknesses and failures, both as a salesman and as a parent. And this begins when Bernard, the next-door neighbor's son, hard-working son, comes over to get Biff, whom he's supposed to be tutoring in math. And when he arrives, Bernard says, "If you don't get studying math, Biff, you're going to flunk and you won't graduate." Well, Willie simply dismisses this. Bernard goes off alone, and the Lomans laugh at him. Willie says, "Bernard is not well-liked, is he?" Biff says, "Well, he's liked, but he's not well-liked." "That's right, Pop," Happy says, to which Willie then adds, "That's just what I mean. Bernard can get the best marks in school, you understand, but when he gets out into the business world, you understand, you are going to be 5 times ahead of him." Yeah, because the man who makes an appearance in the business world, the man who creates personal interest, is the man who gets ahead. Be liked, and you will never want. You take me, for instance. I never have to wait in line to see a buyer. Willie Loman's here. That's all I have to say. That's all they have to know. And I go right through. Well, this, of course, is a lie. But note that we see here Willie's shortcomings as a parent become readily apparent, and also as a salesman, because Willie misunderstands the Bootstrap Myth. He doesn't understand that financial success comes through hard work, not through popularity, not through the cult of personality. And failing to recognize that, he doesn't make much money, and indeed, trying so hard to be popular, he also tends to alienate people, and he never really succeeds in that. Thus, he preaches to his son a gospel that has failed for him. Thus, he mocks Bernard's good grades, foolishly dismisses Biff's need to study. As a result, Biff never learns discipline or how to work productively. Now, where did Willie get this misguided idea, this misreading of the American Bootstrap Myth? Well, it didn't come through any particular experience in his childhood, but rather, perhaps, through a lack of one. He had no father figure that he can really remember to teach him. Only the heroic description of his father provided by his much older brother, Ben. Ben presents their father as someone who has fulfilled both the bootstrap and Western myths, but Willie can't personally recall this man who disappeared in his childhood, and so he has no real understanding of how hard his father worked. So, having no role model himself, he finds that he is filled with insecurity and instead clings to the idea that success somehow comes through popularity. As we'll see, it's an idea he derives from a misunderstanding of an 80-year-old salesman that he once met in Boston. But it leads him, this lack of a role model, lack of a father figure that he can recall, to a certain insecurity. Thus, when he recalls Ben's visit about the same time as the scene of the car polishing, he says, Ben, you're just what I need, because I have a fine position here, but Dad left when I was such a baby, and I never had a chance to talk to him, and I still feel kind of temporary about myself. It's a crucial line. Willie feels temporary about himself because despite his bravado before his sons, he lacks any clear idea of who he is. In the absence of self-knowledge and in the absence of an understanding of the importance of hard work, he sets a poor professional example for his adolescent sons, even as they revere him, and gives them advice that indeed has failed in his own professional life. The memory of speaking to these boys as they polish the car reveals also a moral failure of another kind. Willie excuses and even encourages Biff's stealing and his reckless behavior. He excuses his pilfering a football and excuses his driving without a license. Willie even recalls bragging to the visiting Ben about the lumber that he encouraged his sons to steal from the building site, something, quote, he says is worth all kinds of money. Now, Willie assumes that crimes like that trivial crimes, he thinks, will be forgiven if one is charming and popular enough. But it's notable that when Biff is accused of theft, when he's caught, Willie then disavows all responsibility for encouraging him along this line. What is he stealing? He says he's giving it back, isn't he? Why is he stealing? What did I tell him? I never in my life told him anything but decent things. Thus, he disavows his own complicity. Willie's lie to himself here indicates that he feels guilt about what he has done to pervert Biff's sense of right and wrong, but he refuses to own that guilt. He tries to disavow it. Indeed, one of Willie's greatest weaknesses is his tendency to lie not just to others by bragging and exaggerating, but to lie to himself. Another parental failure that emerges from these memories of Biff's high school days is Willie's clear preference for his older son. While he values Happy's adoration, he has invested most of his hopes and praise in his elder son. Happy tries and fails to get his attention in this memory. He says, "Look at me, Dad, look at me, I'm losing weight." Happy feels ignored. He feels he's a kind of accessory to Biff, and this feeds his resentment of Willie as an adult, as we'll see. Now, even though Happy is achieving the financial success as an adult that Willie sought, Willie nonetheless derides him for it. He says, "Your women and your car and your apartment, they mean nothing." Why? Because Happy lacks popularity, the popularity that Willie has fetishized. But Happy does resemble his father in one respect. In his loneliness, Happy too relies on women to relieve his solitude and boost his ego, as we've seen, while also seducing the wives and girlfriends of his bosses in order to do them in. Well, having long concentrated his hopes on Biff, Willie still does, despite repeated disappointments, try to cling to some hope for Biff's future. Consider this conversation he has with his long-suffering neighbor, Charlie. He says, Biff's going back to Texas again. What the hell is that? Let him go. I got nothing to give him, Charlie. I'm clean. He won't starve. None of them starve. Forget about him. Then what have I got to remember? Willie asks. You take it too hard, Willie. To hell with it. When a deposit bottle is broken, you don't get your nickel back. To which Willie says, that's easy enough for you to say. Willie means it's easy for Charlie to say give up on Biff as a broken man because his own son Bernard is a success. He's a lawyer. And Willie won't relinquish hope, can't let himself relinquish hope completely in Biff. His memory of Biff's promise is all that he has, and thus his hope that that promise will be fulfilled in the future is what he clings to. So Willie soon tries to renew his hope for Biff's future in the present of the play, as he has done so many times before. But it's notable that the past, as I've observed, is not always Willie's refuge from the present, nor can Willie, as we've seen, always control what he remembers. His sense of present failure pains him when he recalls missed opportunities from the past, especially when he recalls not going to Alaska at Ben's invitation. This seems to have occurred not long after the scene with the car polishing. Willie views Ben, as he views his father, as the successful embodiment of both American myths, though I think the implication is that Ben has actually perverted the Bootstrap and Western myths that their father more genuinely embodied. Why? Well, before going to Alaska, we find that Ben first went east, not west, first east to Africa, where he mined diamonds by exploiting the natives. He brags about this when Willie asks his advice. Ben says, boasting, that when Willie says, I'm afraid I'm not teaching my sons the right kind of... Ben, what should I teach them? How should I teach them? Ben, giving great weight to each word with a certain vicious audacity, says, William, when I walked into the jungle in Africa, I was 17, and when I walked out, I was 21, and by God, I was rich. Now, you'll note that Ben lives by the law of the jungle. He has no moral scruples at all, and thus he is certainly no one to advise Willie on how to teach and what to teach his sons. Ben preaches profit at any cost, and he tries to impart this lesson to Biff when they are boxing during this remembered visit. As they playfully square off, Willie says, go to it, Biff, show him. Biff says, okay, and cocks his fist and starts in. A moment later, Ben says, good boy, and suddenly comes in, trips Biff, and stands over him, the point of his umbrella poised over Biff's eye. Never fight fair with a stranger, Ben says. Never fight fair, boy. You'll never get out of the jungle that way. Now, you'll note that as an adult, Biff rejects this lesson in violent competition on how to subvert others, but Happy, on the other hand, has clearly adopted it, although it has made him miserable in the process. Ben's pernicious advice here on getting ahead in the law of the jungle by doing in others and trickery at any cost, you might say, conflicts with Willie's gospel that success lies in being well-liked rather than in subverting others. But the fact is that Ben does get ahead by his savagery, while Willie realizes, even in his flashbacks, that his own attempts to advance by being popular have failed almost completely. Willie was clearly lying to himself then when he boasted, even when they were teenagers, about being welcomed all over New England. But he needed their belief in him then to sustain what was already a faltering belief in himself. It's faltered far more in the years that followed, but even then it had cracks. And that loss of self-confidence has become far more devastating for the 62-year-old Willie of the present. But again, he had doubts about himself even at the time of what was certainly one of his happiest memories, when Biff said that he would score a touchdown for him. Indeed, Willie recalls confessing that fear years earlier to Linda when saying to her what he would never say to his sons. He says, my God, $120, if business doesn't pick up, I don't know what I'm going to do. The trouble is, Linda, people just don't seem to take to me. When I walk up, they seem to laugh at me, or else they pass me by. I'm not noticed. I'm fat. I'm very foolish. And to look at it, Linda, I mean, there was a buyer, and I heard him say something about a walrus, and I cracked him right across the face. I won't take that. I simply will not take that. But they do laugh at me, I know that. That phrase, I will not take that, is the essence of Willie's protest that makes him tragic for Miller. His refusal to be regarded with disrespect, his attempted assertion of his dignity against a world that would mock him and rob him of that dignity. Now, even if we recognize Willie's mistakes and self-delusions, Miller nonetheless wants us to respect that attempt to assert himself and his own dignity, not to pity Willie, but rather to fear that we could be in Willie's situation. Now, just as Willie lies to his sons about his popularity and success, he also sometimes lies to Linda about other things, even though he confesses his doubts professionally to her. Other things he lies about. Immediately after describing this recollection of confessing his failures, he moves to another memory, which is even more painful. It's the memory of the woman whom he slept with on the road and whom Biff will discover in a moment of crushing disillusionment. She drifts in. We're told the woman has come from behind the scrim and is standing, putting on her hat, looking into the mirror and laughing. Willie says, it's because I get so lonely, especially when business is bad and there's nobody to talk to. But the woman says, but Willie, I picked you. You picked me? Yes, I think you're a wonderful man. Willie says again, you picked me, eh? Now clearly what Willie seeks in this woman isn't so much sex as emotional support in Linda's absence. You picked me. Her flattery, given in exchange for a gift of nylons, helps Willie cope with his failures on the road. It artificially reinflates his ego, like the praise that his sons lavish on him. But there's no real sense of a self underlying this artificial pumped-up self-conception of success, of specialness. None of the self-knowledge, in short, that we find in Shakespeare's tragic heroes. For Miller, that kind of self-knowledge isn't a requirement for tragedy. Now, in fact, part of Willie's tragedy is that he never really discovers who he is as an individual, but only that he wants dignity and respect in the world's eyes, though paradoxically they don't require much self-understanding. But instead, at the age of 62, Willie is mocked even more than he was earlier, mocked as an aging relic or simply ignored. Linda reveals to Biff and Happy that Willie's company has taken away his salary after 36 years and that his boss is forcing Willie to work entirely on a slim sales commission. Memories that began then as consoling escapes sometimes force Willie to relive, as we've seen, his deepest traumas at other times. For example, in the midst of his card game with Charlie, Willie recalls Ben's judgment of his failure as a wage earner. He recalls when Ben said, "Our father made more in a week than a man like you could make in a lifetime." Now, Ben, who also, remember, stood over Biff with an umbrella in his eye, is a castrating force who makes both Willie and Biff feel unmanned. And this helps to explain Biff and Willie's codependency. As insecure, damaged men, they need one another and feed off one another in certain ways. Even as Willie rails against Biff as a drifter who's failed to live up to his own dreams, Willie still desperately needs to invest hope for the future in Biff. And as Willie's memories become more troubling and more uncontrolled, his only alternative then to the present, the unbearable present, is sights on Biff's imaginary future. Linda explains Willie's need to believe in this future to Biff unmistakably. She says he likes to have a letter from you just to know that there's still a possibility of better things. And when you write you're coming, he's all smiles and talks about the future. It's just wonderful. And then you get closer and you seem to come and things gets more shaky. He gets then, and by the time you're here, he's arguing and he seems angry at you. Biff says, "I just can't take hold, Mom. I just can't take hold of some kind of life." Note that distance, as Linda explains, nourishes Willie's hope. But even when Biff returns home, and Willie is confronted with Biff's failures, he even then, in proximity, sometimes is so desperate to believe in Biff that he summons up visions of Biff's triumph and his own vicarious pleasure. A moment after Willie telling Biff, "You never grew up," Willie seizes suddenly on Biff's dubious announcement that he plans to see Bob Harrison about fronting him money for a sporting goods business. And he pivots completely now in the direction of desperate hope in the future. No sooner does he hear this than he says, "Don't interrupt. There's 50 men in the city of New York who'd stake him." "Oh, Biff, sporting goods, is it?" Biff says, "Yeah, I guess so. I know something about it." "Know something about it? You know sporting goods better than Spaulding, for God's sake. How much is he giving? How much? How much?" Jumping already to impossible conclusions. Now, you'll note that when Happy then, a moment later, builds on this rare moment of enthusiasm by suggesting that the three of them all work together to create a Loman line of sporting goods and link it to sports teams, when he hears this, Willie is thrilled because this vision of the future connects with his happiest moments of the past when he and his sons worked together and they believed in him, even if he was lying to them about his financial success. Happy says, we'd be a family again. It'd be the old honor. Well, like Linda, Happy knows that this is what Willie needs. Not just family support, but a sense of dignity founded on some hope in Biff, no matter how improbable. As Linda tells Biff, quote, "Willie's life is in your hands," literally in Biff's hands. She explains that Willie is not only losing his mind, but he has become suicidal. The car wreck on the bridge wasn't an accident, and Willie has hidden, though she's found it, a small rubber pipe to attach to a car's tailpipe so that he could gas himself to death in the garage. Even though Willie calls the sporting goods scheme a $1 million idea, he's clearly deceiving himself because he and Happy both know that Biff is completely unsuited for business. Biff has no interest in making money, and Biff has, after all, absorbed and lived by Willie's misguided advice by trying to get ahead by being liked and failing in that. Biff says, "It's just that I don't fit into business." And he's absolutely right. But he sees his father's desperation and, in a sense, throws him this crumb of hope because it pains him. Now, Happy understands why Biff cannot succeed in the business world. The hyper-competitive son never made a pretext of being liked in business. He hates those people he works with, and they seem to hate him. Biff, on the other hand, has tried to be liked and has absorbed that idea from Willie. Happy knows that Biff has failed when he has attempted to follow Willie's advice by trying to please people in unserious ways. And so he warns his brother that this is not going to work if he tries to go into business. Happy says, like when you started to work for Harrison back when you were a teenager, Bob Harrison said you were tops, and then you go and do some damn fool thing like whistling whole songs in the elevator like a comedian. Biff says, "Well, so what? I like to whistle sometimes." But Happy says, "You don't raise a guy to be a responsible job who whistles in the elevator. You just don't do that." Now, you'll note that this same misguided approach has caused Willie's own failure as a businessman. He would rather schmooze and tell jokes than sell. Instead of learning from his mistakes and adopting to a faster-paced American marketplace, Willie still tries to sell by joking and backslapping in an attempt to be like, an approach that never worked to begin with, let alone now, but which Biff has inherited. Instead, Willie now is mocked, and it is a source of pain for Biff to see and for Linda to see. Biff knows now that Willie was laughed at even when he and his brother revered him. He tells Happy, they laughed at Dad then for years. And you know why? Because he and I don't belong in this nut house of a city. We should be out mixing cement. Well, just as Willie feels betrayed by Biff's failures, Biff feels betrayed that the man that he and Happy thought was celebrated all over New England wasn't real. He was a laughable fraud, an imposter. As Biff puts it, quote, "I know now he's a fake, and he doesn't like anybody around who knows it." Happy has been better able to live with Willie's fraudulence, which he sees too, because Happy never invested as much faith in his father as Biff did, since he was always feeling to some degree or another ignored and overshadowed. Even Linda ignores him when Happy says that he's going to get married. Whether it's true or not, we don't know, but she doesn't take it seriously. But Biff did invest massive faith in Willie, just as Willie has invested massive faith in Biff, in his dreams. They constantly argue then, these two, because each sees in the other not just a source of betrayal and disillusionment, but also sees in the other a painful image of his own failed dreams. Neither Willie nor Biff has really grown up, and the father and son see their own paralysis, their own failure to grow and develop and adapt, mirrored in one another. Neither can change. Consider Willie's advice to Biff to demonstrate this inability to change regarding the business meeting. At first, it sounds as if Willie has actually learned something from his own failures, but then, compulsively, almost automatically, he harkens back to his old failed advice. Make yourself charming and lie if you have to. He says, when he begins this bit of advice, he starts out by saying, walk in very seriously, Biff. You're not applying for a boy's job. Money is to pass. Be quiet, fine, serious. Everybody likes a kidder, but nobody lends him money, so be serious. For once, it seems like good advice, but then, he says, no, start off with a couple of good stories to lighten things up. It's not what you say, it's how you say it, because personality always wins the day. And he continues in that vein, contradicting what he had earlier said before that had some actual legitimacy. Tell him you were in business out west. Don't tell him you just did farm work. Oh, he says, Biff, you've got greatness in you. Remember that. You got all kinds of greatness. Yeah. Tell stories and lie. Willie recycles this bad advice, of course, which he had told them as teenagers, not so much because he still really believes it himself, but he tells it, I think, now in part to legitimize himself as a father, to reclaim his dignity within the family by reinforcing the advice he gave Biff in his youth, as if to say, you see, I was right even then. Now, of course, he's ignoring the fact that this approach to life, trying to be popular, the whistling in elevator syndrome, has failed for both Biff and himself. Feeling his own dignity assaulted in his job and at home, then, Willie seeks self-respect by treating Biff as if Biff is still the malleable great hope that he groomed in high school, still that individual of unlimited promise. He says, he's like a young god, a Hercules, something like that. And the sun all around him. Oh, remember how he waved at me from the football field? A star, magnificent, can never really fade away. Oh, yeah, he's going to succeed. Well, Biff knows that neither he nor Willie can ever succeed in business. But he offers his father this vicarious hope at Linda's urging and at his own sense of pain in order to save his father's life, because Linda has presented it as essential to save the suicidal Willie. But Biff understands that the only time that either he or Willie found any real satisfaction in work was when they were using their hands, when they were waxing the car together, or building a concrete stoop, or making things. Thus, he says to Happy, we should be mixing cement on some open plain, or be carpenters. They're at least allowed to whistle. Well, note, Willie has rejected what he's good at, working with his hands, rejected what he enjoys, and even brags to Charlie about why? Because in his interpretation of the American dream, in his understanding of it, that dream of success implies upward mobility through the making of money. Making of money is essential, and bricklayers and carpenters don't make enough. It's this idea of financial exceptionalism that is misguided, and that is essential to Willie's idea of his place in the world. Again, his sense of dignity relies upon his sense of being a white-collar worker, even though it's not what he's good at, and even though it may be a flaw and a delusion. For Miller, it's something that is inseparable from his tragic quest for dignity. The key, I think, to Willie is that although he is socially and economically a common man, he refuses to be an ordinary man. And I would stress the difference between those words. Willie may be common, middle class, but he isn't typical. He isn't ordinary. Linda is the only one who understands the existential importance of Willie's fragile dream of self-worth. And despite his mistreatment of Linda, Willie knows that she's the only one who really has faith in him or who recognizes his inner stature, his inner extraordinariness. She explains this in the play's most famous lines, which I think unmistakably echo Miller's definition of the common man as tragic hero, when she puts it this way to her son, Biff and Happy. I don't say your father's a great man. Willie Loman never made a lot of money. His name was never in the paper. He's not the finest character that ever lived, but he's a human being, and a terrible thing is happening to him, so attention must be paid. He's not to be allowed to fall into the grave like an old dog. Attention must be paid for such a person. A small man can be just as exhausted as a great man. He works for a company 36 years this March, opens up unheard of territories to their trademark, and now in his old age, they take his salary away. Is this his reward, to turn around at the age of 63 and find his sons who loved him better than life on one a floundering bum? And no, you must succeed. You must somehow give him hope, she says. She puts it on them and Biff in particular. Now, Linda doesn't idealize this man that she loves, but her chief concern is for Willie's basic human dignity as he conceives of it. Attention must be paid to that dignity, both by Willie's sons who have turned away from him and by the company that has devalued his self-worth and isolated him and made him feel so useless. Well, as Act 1 closes, the family goes to bed with two great but deluded expectations that build on one another. First, Biff's meeting with Harrison, and second, Willie's meeting with his boss, Howard. At Linda's urging, Willie plans to ask Howard if he can give up the arduous life on the road to which he's been assigned and work just in New York. Both meetings are to take place the next day, as we see in Act 2.